started. Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all. Just a few announcements before we get into tonight's presentation. First and foremost, great turnout on Saturday. Thank you to all the members who came and everybody who supported the event. If you asked the mayor said nearly 100 people. I think that was a bit hyperbolic, but we probably were somewhere in the area 50 to 75-ish.
My sister wanted 75.
75, so regardless of whether it's 50, 75, 100, very good turnout. So thank you to everybody. We were able to get some advertisement out to local media outlets this year, so I think that really helped. And hopefully we have a few new recruits to the organization too as well. There were some new faces there that we were able to talk to, share a little bit of what we do with, especially the Rhode Island chapter of the Sons of Union Veterans who came to help. One of their members, Jamie, indicated that he was very interested in joining us too. So all great stuff, and thank you to everybody for their support for the event. And we'll look forward again to next year. Tuesday, June 23rd is our next meeting. Note we're going to do a slightly different start time, 6:30 p.m. rather than 6. Normally we would do a June picnic in the past. The board has made the decision, which I think is the correct decision, that we're going to do without the picnic, but we still need to have a membership meeting. So what we're going to do is we're going to have more of a round table actual setup. Some chairs, we'll have some refreshments like we normally do, maybe some lemonade, some other sweets and pastries. So eat beforehand, don't show up expecting a meal, eat beforehand. And we'll go over basically this year in review, we'll talk a little bit about our financials, what we've been able to achieve. We'll open the floor to all of you for your input about what you'd like to see us doing, what you think we do well, what you'd like to see us improve in the future. So all of that and more, and then we will elect our new board for the next year. Nobody took me up on the offer of president, unfortunately. There's always next year, please, next year, somebody who would be interested in being president of this organization. I know I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I do actually genuinely mean that. I think it's good for an organization when there's different leadership and leadership changes, rather than the same person who's at the helm all the time. So if you are interested, please do consider, because I do think a change in leadership would be good. I will continue on as long as my wife allows me to continue on in this role, as long as you all don't, nobody steps forward to take on that role. But I do genuinely think it's a good thing to have new leadership too. So do consider if anybody's interested in next year. A little late now for this upcoming season, but for the 2027-2028 season, if you are interested, please let me know. Schedules, speaking of which, for 2026-2027 are in the back by the book raffle. So we have our whole schedule out for our next speaker season. Remember, we do speaker seasons like the school year, September through June. So please, while supplies last, I have a few printed out in the back if you want to take a copy. You're more than welcome to. We will also be sending this with the June flag bearer too as well. So if you want to wait for the June flag bearer, you can do so. And also coming with your June flag bearer are new membership forms. We'll be starting our new membership season July 1st. Our season runs July 1st through June 30th. So on July 1st, we'll all need to re-up our membership if you are interested. So you can grab a form in the back, or again, that will come in with the June flag bearer as well. All that out of the way, let's get into the reason why we're all here, tonight's presentation. So we are very lucky to be joined once again by David Kelly. Associate Professor Kelly is the program manager of the Navy War College's non-resident graduate degree program since 2010. He joined the faculty of the College of Distance Education as an associate professor in 2007, working on the Navy's online professional military education courses. He served as a surface warfare officer aboard the USS Barnstable County, where he participated in non-combatant evacuation operations, and as a naval gunfare liaison officer with the 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, with whom he took part in Operation Restore Hope in Mogadishu, Somalia. He is a graduate of Texas Tech University School of Law, graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1986. Tonight, Professor Kelly will be presenting on From Rocky to Rock Solid, the Lincoln and Seward relationship. Professor Kelly has spoken to us many times before. It's always a very engaging, interesting, and thought-provoking presentation, so I look forward to hearing tonight's presentation. Professor Kelly.
I really wish you didn't say what you were graduating. Kind of dates me.
It was in your bio.
Oh, okay, that's okay. Thanks for that introduction. It's always a pleasure to be here. Talking to you all once again. As a notice, this meeting stated, I'm an associate professor of joint military operations at the United States Naval War College and the program manager of the college's non-resident graduate degree program. Because of that, before we begin, it's important that I give the following. This presentation was prepared by me in my personal capacity. The opinions expressed here are my own and do not reflect the view of the U.S. Naval War College, the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, the Department of War, or the United States government. Now that that's out of the way, fun stuff. Once again, I am Dave Kelly. This is me. It's my favorite place on the Gettysburg battlefield. I'm in front of the Pennsylvania Monument. The smaller monument up front is Battery A, 1st New Jersey Artillery, which served from August 12, 1861 to Appomattox. Soft spot for me. I'm born and raised in New Jersey before I moved to a bunch of other places and ended up in Rhode Island. In checking my records, I realized I first spoke to y'all in October 2019, and I can't believe it's been that long. It just doesn't seem like it was that long ago. We were next door in the museum, had a great time, and I realized you guys asked some really hard questions, so hopefully I'll be able to answer them. Some of you might remember my presentation then concerned the Trent Affair. From researching that event, I developed a great interest in the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and William Seward, the Secretary of State, to the point where it will hopefully be the subject of my upcoming dissertation. And from that interest, I developed this presentation on the relationship between these two men during the early years of the Civil War. I do hope that y'all will find the topic as interesting as I have. Perhaps the best place to start talking about this relationship was the Republican Convention of 1860 held in Chicago from May 16th to 18th, 1860. The Republican Party was a relatively new party which ran its first presidential candidate in the 1856 election. And that would have been John Fremont, who was defeated by James Buchanan in the election of 1856. In this new party, William Seward of New York, former senator and governor, was probably the most prominent member and most well known. He was expected to win the nomination in 1860 and to run for president. He actually had sat out the 1856 election, the idea being a brand new party, let's wait, get people used to it, and then we'll put him in 1860, clean house, and get the presidency. Unfortunately for Seward, he had gained quite the reputation of being a radical, and that alienated those party members from the border states and conservatives from the deceased Whig Party. The party had other possible candidates, including Salmon Chase, a former senator from Ohio, who, like Seward, was handicapped because of his reputation as a radical. Former Senator Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania, whose membership in a number of other political parties gave him many enemies. Edward Bates, former representative from Missouri, who, while having the support of the border states, turned off many Republicans because he was a slave owner, and was once a member of the Know Nothing Party, which alienated German Americans. And he had also supported Millard Fillmore against the Republican candidate John Fremont in the 1856 election. Finally, there was Abraham Lincoln, former representative from Illinois, whose strong point that he was seen as a moderate. Many former anti-slavery Democrats now in the Republican Party remembered that in his run for Senate in 1855, Lincoln stepped aside so that the anti-slavery Democrat Lyman Trumbull could win the 1855 Senate election. In the first ballot, Lincoln was seen as a dark horse candidate. However, he scored well, just behind William Seward, but far ahead of the other candidates. On the second ballot, Pennsylvania delegates switched their votes from Cameron to Lincoln because Lincoln's staff or supporters had promised Cameron that he would receive a cabinet position should Lincoln win. Now this is fascinating because Lincoln himself told his people, do not promise anything should I win. Back then, candidates didn't run for the nomination. They had their people attend the convention and backroom deals and things like that decide who was going to be the candidate. But Lincoln told his folks, do not make promises, but obviously they did. And Simon Cameron's, what do you want to call them, participants switched their votes to Lincoln. On the third ballot, Seward again fell short. You notice he's pretty consistent with his numbers. He was not able to reach the magic number of 233 candidates because there was too many, quote-unquote, never Sewards in attendance. And Lincoln gained votes now from Chase supporters who left Chase and added on to Lincoln. The result was close. He almost has enough. And then the Ohio delegation then threw 4 more votes to Lincoln, putting him over the top. And he was quickly followed by other people that joined on the bandwagon. So Lincoln wins the nomination, basically coming out of nowhere. Seward, who was all but certain he was going to get the nomination, was in his home in New York. And one can only imagine his disappointment when he got the news. This has been his driving force for quite a long time. The election of 1860 was a 4-way race. Split among sectional lines, Lincoln was greatly assisted through party unity, including Seward and his supporters who campaigned for Lincoln. Lincoln would win the election and become president. And of course, as we know, Lincoln's election resulted in South Carolina seceding from the Union in December 1860, followed by other southern states during the subsequent months. In the time before his inauguration, Lincoln formed his cabinet, which included all of his major opponents who sought the Republican nomination. Doris Kearns Goodwin has a great book, Team of Rivals, where she talks about his forming of his cabinet among his former rivals for the nomination. Fascinating reading. Lincoln was greatly expected and did ask Seward to serve as his Secretary of State. It should be noted that back then, the Secretary of State's responsibilities included much more than just foreign affairs, and in many ways, the Secretary of State acted as the Chief of Staff for the President, taking care of both domestic and foreign things. The secession of South Carolina left a small federal army garrison in Charleston isolated and surrounded by hostile forces. Holed up in Fort Sumter in Charleston, Lincoln wanted to send reinforcements and supplies to the garrison. For reasons unknown, Seward, however, believed that Sumter should be abandoned. And instead, forts such as Fort Pickens, guarding Pensacola Bay, should be heavily defended. Seward indicated at the time to Southern commissioners who were in Washington trying to work a deal. Lincoln refused to meet with them because he didn't want to recognize the seceding states as anything that the United States government should be dealing with. But Seward kind of passed the word to them that Fort Sumter would be abandoned. And that was good news to them, and they felt pretty good about that. However, there were some problems. Lincoln did not want to abandon Sumter. He saw that that was a very important position to keep, being that it was in Charleston Harbor, you know, the seat of the rebellion. So he was going to refuse to give that up, which put Seward in kind of a bind. Lincoln wanted to send a relieving force to Fort Sumter to give them supplies, no troops, just supplies and maybe some reinforcements, but I think that decision later went away. Seward, however, thought that these ships and forces should go to Pensacola. And he, not quite sure how this worked, but apparently he gave Lincoln some orders telling the ships to go to Pensacola. Now, Lincoln's doing all kinds of things during these early months, including appointing postmasters and game wardens and things like that, because every federal position had to be approved by the president. So he's doing all this stuff, and Seward says, here, sign these, Mr. President. President signs it. They go to the ships get orders signed by the president, they head down to Pensacola, including the more heavily armed warships. When this is found out, it was too late to undo, and Lincoln, this kind of tells you something about him, instead of pointing fingers and saying, why'd you do this, well, who gave you these, how'd this happen, Lincoln suggested it was his own fault, because he didn't carefully read the orders to the Navy ships before signing them. Now, Seward perhaps interpreted this as an example of the buck stops here. Or he could have seen this as the president admitting his own incompetence. From what happens, it looks like Seward interpreted it as the latter. Lincoln had earlier reportedly told Seward that he knew little about foreign policy and affairs. So during this time, Seward drafts a memo to Lincoln, and he says, you know, these southern states, they're not going for good. They'll come back if something happens. Let's get in a war with Spain and France. That's a good thing to do, because then it will unite the country, the South will come back, and everything will be fine. And by the way, you don't have any foreign policy going on, nor domestic policy. I tell you what, Mr. President, it should be somebody's business to do it, and meaning it should be something I did. Lincoln made it clear that if policy were to be created and put in action, he was the person that was going to do it. And he replied, nah, if something must be done, I'm the president, I'll do it. You have to think that this exchange kind of ruffled Lincoln's feathers. You know, who is this guy? I'm the president, he's making decisions, he's saying he should run things. Secretary of the Navy Wells actually reported that Seward liked being called the premier. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So Lincoln's a little upset with his Secretary of State, and there's evidence that in early dispatches that Seward sent to the American Embassy in London, Lincoln made some pen and ink changes and kind of toned down the rhetoric, made it seem a little bit more friendly. You know, Lincoln was basically proofreading Seward's stuff before it was sent down. But in the end, Sumter falls and the fort surrenders. The two men were able to put aside their differences and decided to work together to solve this problem that was enveloping the nation. Lincoln would spend more and more time with the Secretary of State, often visiting his home until late in the evening. Doris Kearns Goodwin said, quote, between official meetings and private get-togethers, Lincoln spent more time with Seward in his first year of the presidency than with anyone else, including his own family. It was not therefore surprising that the possessive Mary Lincoln felt rancor, I love that word, towards Seward and his family. Indeed, Mary Lincoln was said to have said, if things should go on all right, the credit will go to Seward. If they go all wrong, the blame will fall upon my husband. She really didn't care for Seward. Now, during this time, I think the two of them started to know each other a lot better. Lincoln was not the country bumpkin that many folks of Seward's background thought him to be. Lincoln came to respect Seward's ability to read a situation and understand public opinion. Seward, when he found out that Lincoln the Lincoln family left their dog in Illinois when they moved to Washington, D.C., and heard about the president's love for cats, presented the president 2 kittens, which he named
You just put it on the counter.
which he named Tabby and Dixie. And the president really loved these cats. He would actually have them on the dining room table in the White House. Once he was feeding one of the kittens with a gold fork on the table, and Mary Lincoln just went off. She was just incensed that he would do that. And Lincoln said, you know, if the gold fork in the White House was good enough for President Buchanan, it's good enough for Tabby. So, yeah, that's a funny story. And Lincoln was apparently playing with these cats, and when Seward's family moved to D.C., his daughter was a young girl. Now, picture this. This is a little girl who's meeting the man who destroyed her dad's dreams. Okay? And her comment in her diary was, I liked him very much. Seward's wife, very high society woman, wrote to a friend that she found Lincoln a plain and unassuming farmer, not awkward or ungainly at all. He had won over Seward's family. And Lincoln had a sense of humor, and he would often use Seward as the butt of his jokes. There's a story where they're going through Washington, D.C. in a carriage, and they get stuck in this big mud puddle. Because remember, D.C. was basically a swamp back then. So it gets stuck, and the coachman is, whipping the horses, and he's cursing up a storm. You can just imagine what he says. And Lincoln says, excuse me, sir, my friend, are you an Episcopalian? And the coachman says, no. Why? And the president says, oh, I thought you must be an Episcopalian because you swear just like Secretary Seward, and he's a deacon. So it tells you that kind of their relationship's improving to the point where Seward writes his wife, this is in August, that executive force and vigor are rare qualities. The president is the best of us. This is a guy who just a couple months earlier said, hey, Mr. President, you have no policy. Let me do it. Let it be run by a professional. And now he's telling his wife this. And I just have to assume that this was not made up because he wrote it in a letter that nobody would have seen. So let's put this relationship to its first test. In November 1861, the U.S. warship San Jacinto stopped the British mail ship Trent and removed from it 2 Confederate emissaries, James Mason and John Slidell, who were heading to Europe in hope to drum up support for the Confederacy. Not surprisingly, the British government and people were outraged and even contemplated war with the United States. While in the United States, there were joyous celebrations which countered the disappointment felt after the initial Union defeat at Bull Run earlier that summer. While initially enthusiastic about the capture of these 2 men, Lincoln soon realized that war with Britain was a real possibility, and if that should happen, he might not be able to pursue his goal of reuniting the United States. On the other side of the Atlantic, the British government felt that it had no other choice but to take an aggressive stance. Now, this was somewhat bothersome to the Brits because just earlier they were involved in the Crimean War with France against Russia, and this was in the Crimea section of what is now, well, it's either Ukraine or the Soviet Union, who knows, or Russia. But that was a very costly war for the Brits. Out of 100,000 troops sent over, 20,000 died, a lot of them by disease. It spent a lot of money in the British government, and the British military realized that doing long-distance warfare was not their forte. Their logistical problems were immense, and they didn't do so well because of that. And now they're looking at possibly going to war against the United States. Okay? But they can't back down. An American ship had basically stopped a British ship and removed people. Not just a British ship, but a British mail ship. That's a big deal. It's a government vessel, sovereign property, and all that. So working this out was the British ambassador to the U.S., Lord Lyons, and William Seward, U.S. Secretary of State. Now this was interesting. Most people at the time did not think you would get an amicable solution because Seward had a reputation of being a bit of a blowhard, and he really didn't like the Brits that much. Lyons, on the other hand, didn't think highly of Seward, to the point of perhaps being mistrustful of him. Both sides waited for instructions to arrive for Lyons from London. When Lyons, now remember, there was no cable, there was no radio, there was no airmail. Dispatches were sent by ship. It could take a couple of weeks for a ship to go from London to New York, and then they would have to take a train to DC. So it was quite the lengthy process. So both Lyons and Seward are waiting to see what London's going to do. So Lyons receives his instructions, this date's important, 18 December, and what London tells him is they demanded that Lyons arrange for the release of the two Confederates removed from Trent and an apology from the United States government. If the U.S. government did not respond within 7 days of the dispatch being delivered to it, Lyons was to pack up his stuff and return home. That's a clear indication of war is the next step. If, however, in Lyons' opinion, the Americans substantially complied with the British demands, he was to report to London and await further instructions. Now, Lyons is a smart man. He's a career diplomat. He's one of Queen Victoria's favorites. He realized how little time the Americans had to make a monumental decision that most of the American public had firm ideas about. So what he does is he works with Seward, who finally also realized the gravity of the situation, and they developed a workaround. And it was kind of like a conspiracy that would give the Americans more time to develop a response, without Lyons having to disobey his orders. Now remember, his orders are, when the Americans get the dispatch, they have 7 days. So what Lyons does is, he says, well, I got this dispatch. If I give it to you, you have 7 days to reply. So I'm just not going to give it to you right now, but let me tell you what it says. And I don't know if he reads it to him or explains it to him, but he tells Seward in no uncertain terms, this is what my government's demanding that you do within 7 days when I give you this dispatch that I just read to you. So then Seward briefs Lincoln, and I'm not quite sure what went on in this briefing, but I think Seward basically laid out the whole thing. And on December 23rd, Lyons, this was what, 5 days after Lyons got the dispatch, he couldn't wait any longer in good conscience. He finally gives the dispatch to Seward and says, you already know what's in it, here it is, you now only have 7 days, which would be December 30th. The United States government now is between a rock and a hard place. It could refuse London's demand and risk war, which would most likely result in the Confederacy eventually gaining its independence. On the other hand, it could give in to the British demands, risk the loss of political and moral support from its own people, which could also result in a halting of the prosecution of the war and assist the Confederates in gaining their independence. So on Christmas Day, Lincoln has a cabinet meeting. Seward concluded that the two Confederates had to be given up, and he read a draft of his proposed response. None of the cabinet members were happy with it. They thought these two guys should be captured. Lincoln decided to postpone any decision until the following day. Let's sleep on it and think about it. He looks to Seward and says, Governor Seward, you will go on, of course, preparing your answer, for which I understand will state the reasons why they ought to be given up. Now, says Lincoln, I have a mind to try my hand at stating the reasons why they ought not to be given up. We will compare the points tomorrow. Now, Seward goes home and spends that whole night furiously writing, draft after draft after draft, changing words, because he knows he's on the spot now. And Lincoln's expecting great things from him, and they're going to have it out the next day on what position they should do. So the next day, Seward, in front of the cabinet, reads his draft, and Lincoln says, cool, let's do that. And Seward's a little bit taken aback, and he says, Mr. President, I thought you were going to read your draft that you talked about the previous day. And what Lincoln responds was this: I found I could not make an argument that would satisfy my own mind, and that proved to me that your ground was the right one. Needless to say, Seward was blown away. There wasn't even any debate. Seward read it, and Lincoln said, thumbs up, let's do that. Later on in the war, Lincoln was asked by a Union officer about this whole matter, and this is what Lincoln said. Seward studied up on all the works ever written on international law and came totally prepared and convinced the cabinet to deliver up the prisoners. Lincoln wasn't going to take credit. He put all the credit to Seward. And I'm sure Seward ended up hearing about this. And so what Seward did is he tells the Brits that, you know, these two guys we were right to remove them from the train. That was the right move. However, there were some procedural mistakes made, so because of that, we're going to give them back to you. They're not that important. In fact, by taking them, you're doing us a favor. I guess we don't have to feed them now, so thanks, England. And more importantly, thank you for proving the point that we made in 1812. You can't just go on ships pulling people off. It gets to the British government, not quite what they were demanding, but it was close enough. It would avoid a war. And the Brits had actually gotten to the point where they were putting troops on troop ships to send over to Canada. And the report was when they were going on the ship, their regimental band was playing Dixie. But anyway, so good move by Seward, and it was important to do. Both sides could exit feeling good about themselves and avoid war, because neither side really wanted that. Okay, so a few months later, Seward, whose dispatches earlier that year were reviewed and modified by the president before being sent to U.S. ambassadors, was appointed the American representative to meet with a British representative to discuss the suppression of the African slave trade. His British counterpart was nobody else but Lord Lyons. The two of them, in a very short time, negotiated and signed what was later known as the Seward-Lyons Treaty, an agreement, get this, which would allow each nation to stop and inspect ships of the other side. The very action that led to the Trent incident. But the big thing was for the U.S., this allowed the United States to pull its ships from anti-slavery patrols and send them to aid in the blockaded southern ports. Lyons and Seward, who had gained increased respect and trust for each other, also worked out a conspiracy, very much like they did during the Trent affair, to make this thing work. To make it more palatable to the American public, Lyons would include in his proposal a series of just outrageous conditions that, in all honesty, were not important at all to the British. This would allow Seward to vigorously protest these. No way in heck are we going to do that, you dumb Brit. And then Lyons would say, well, okay, we'll pull that demand, even though we never really wanted it. And so they were able to come up with a solution that could be presented to the American public as we got everything we wanted, the Brits told. And more importantly, Lyons was able also to tell his government, got the deal done. The Americans are going to, work with us on the anti-slavery patrol. This is one of the incidents, the second time, where Seward has shown he understood what the objective was, and he put aside his own thoughts and his own opinions to pursue the goal of the president. However, at the end of this, Seward didn't have time to rest, though, because two other problems came up, when it rains it pours, especially in the early years of the Civil War. And these were of the domestic type, and they needed his attention, and it also provided further evidence of the acumen he possessed and used to assist Lincoln to aid Union war efforts. Both of these events could trace their origins to my favorite general, General George McClellan's Peninsula Campaign of 1862. I say that tongue in cheek, I hope you realize. At the beginning of 1862, things were looking good for the United States government. War with Britain had been avoided. George McClellan, who had achieved success in Western Virginia, was ordered to Washington and given command of what would become the Army of the Potomac. McClellan got to work organizing and training the Army that would soon number over 100,000 soldiers. His plan was to take his army by sea to Union-held Fortress Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula and advance up it, take Richmond, and end the war. McClellan put his plan into action during the first week of April. A favorable Union end to the war looked not only achievable, but near. As McClellan commenced his operation, the newest members of Lincoln's cabinet, Secretary of War Edmund Stanton, who had relieved Cameron, who was just way over his head. He was just totally unable to handle the job of Secretary of War, so he became ambassador to Russia, I believe. So Stanton comes in, he's Secretary of War, he's gung-ho, he believes victory is near, and because of that, without any direction from Lincoln, he ordered that military recruitment would be discontinued. Recruiting stations closed, and recruiting officers returned to their regiments. Unfortunately, for all concerned, things quickly fell apart. McClellan's Army of the Potomac was defeated in the two-day Battle of Fair Oaks, or Seven Pines, which ended on June 1. By the end of the month, his army had retreated down the peninsula, suffering large number of casualties. This, coupled with the large number of casualties sustained during the April Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee, convinced Lincoln that further expansion of the nation's armies was needed. However, Lincoln felt if he were to ask for more troops at this time, the general public would go into a panic. So he didn't know quite what to do. Seward proved himself the consummate politician, and he has a solution that would raise large number of federal troops while not causing a loss of public morale and support. He knew that several governors were meeting in New York City, and he headed there to put his plan into action. Upon arrival, Seward met with the mayor of New York City, George Opdyke, and he started a rumor that he was discussing raising troops in that city, and that he had already met with the mayor of Philadelphia to do the same thing, and he was going to Boston next. As Seward planned, the rumor quickly reached Andrew Curtin, the governor of Pennsylvania, who then visited Seward to argue that raising troops was a gubernatorial and not mayoral function. Now, this is an important thing. And you wonder, does it really matter who raises the troops? They're all going to go in the army. They're all going to fight the Confederates. Things are good. However, the way the armies were raised back then, they were raised by the states. The governor would appoint who the colonel of that regiment was. And oftentimes actually also appoint the other officers, the company commanders, etc. That is huge because everybody realized if I'm a politician, at the end of the war, I darn well better be able to say I was not only in the war, but I was a commander, a general, blah, blah, blah. So this was a very, very big deal. And so votes would be exchanged, votes would be promised in exchange for things like colonelships, captainships, etc. So Curtin did not want to give that up to mayors or citizen committees. Now, Lincoln Seward was a governor. He was governor of New York. He knew that. So he says, well, you know what? You're right. It is a gubernatorial responsibility. So I tell you what, this is what we're going to do. And he gives Curtin a letter that Seward and Lincoln had drafted previously in which the governors would request that the president make the call for more troops. This was already drafted up. He had one for every governor that was in New York City. And then Seward also showed Curtin dig this, a predated response from the president accepting their request for more troops. What are the governors going to do? So Curtin contacted the other governors who felt they had no alternative but to sign the letter requesting that Lincoln call for more troops. And then, of course, they signed the letters that had already been drafted saying, okay, I accept. As an added enticement, Seward was also able to get Stanton to agree that each recruit would get a portion of their pay in advance. So in the end, responding to the governor's request for more troops, Lincoln was able to raise 300,000 more troops for the Union Army. Seward had played that game perfectly. Seward's solution to this serious problem again showed his ability to understand Lincoln's objectives and his dedication to devising a solution that would accomplish them while mitigating political fallout. Less than a month later, Seward once again demonstrated his abilities and was rewarded with acknowledgement of them by Lincoln. During the Peninsula Campaign, it became clear to Union military leaders the extent to which Confederate forces relied on slave labor to do numerous tasks such as digging trenches, building fortifications, and serving as teamsters, all of which freed up soldiers to fight. Lincoln decided that it would be advantageous to deprive the Confederates of this source of labor. Thus, Lincoln would be able to achieve a step towards his long-held goal of eliminating slavery while justifying it as a military decision. In early July, Lincoln raised his thoughts concerning emancipation to Seward and Wells. Is that Wells? No. Yeah, you passed the test. Good job. I screwed up, had the wrong thing, so. Okay, so it's Wells. So he divulges to Seward and Wells his idea. Hey, let's take this source of labor away from the Confederates. Now, both of these men agree, important. This was discussed in a carriage ride to a cemetery to attend the funeral of one of Stanton's sons who died in infancy. So a sad event, but Lincoln's conducting business in a carriage. So both agreed to the idea, and they said, you know what? Just like we can go in and take railroad locomotives and horses, if the Confederates think slaves are property, we should be able to take those too, if they're being used to pursue the war effort. Now, Seward, you would expect, he was a long-time abolitionist. You would think he would have jumped on that and said, yeah, good idea. But he said, well, wait, let's stop and think about this. So what Lincoln did in response to this get-together, he drafted a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation without knowledge of his cabinet. And he presented it to them at the July 22 cabinet meeting. This proclamation was based on his powers, not just as chief executive of the country, but more importantly, as its commander-in-chief, because it was based on his military necessity. It should be noted that only slaves in areas in rebellion would be freed in order to avoid alienating the critical border states. Some of the cabinet members had some suggestions governing the proclamation, but Lincoln dismissed all of them. No, I like this. This is good as it is. However, Seward had a suggestion. Seward warned the president that given the number of recent Union reversals, this proclamation may be, quote, be viewed as the last measures of an exhausted government, and that it would be better for Lincoln to postpone issuing it until he could, quote, give it to the country supported by military success. Once again, Lincoln, without argument, basically says roger that and puts it in his desk drawer without any discussion. This, perhaps more than anything, demonstrated the trust that Lincoln had in Seward's political acumen and analytical thought. In retelling the story, Lincoln claimed that his reaction to Seward's suggestion was the same as Seward's response to the British government over the Trent affair. He says, the wisdom of the view of the Secretary of State struck me with very great force. It was an aspect of the case that I had entirely overlooked. If you can believe that. But that's what he said. Seward again showed his ability to analyze the situation and what effects reaction of it would cause, both primarily and secondarily. Indeed, after the September 1862 Battle of Antietam, in which General Robert E. Lee's move into Maryland was turned back, Lincoln, following Seward's recommendation, issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And on 1 January 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. The whole tenor of the war had changed. William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, played an important role in the early part of the Civil War. While not starting off with the best of working relationships with the President, his dedication to contribute to the Union war effort and help the President achieve his war objectives made him an invaluable advisor to Lincoln, and Lincoln realized that. His achievements in resolving the Trent Affair were instrumental in avoiding a potentially disastrous war with Great Britain while minimizing any negative public opinion. Similarly, his creative solution to the recruiting problem in 1862 allowed the military to induct hundreds of thousands of badly needed troops without inducing defeatism in the public. Finally, his thoughtfulness and political acumen, I love that word, in recommending a better time for Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation ensured that any advantage obtained through it would not be mitigated. Throughout, Seward proved his value to his president and his country. Thanks. Now, I will tell you, this is the part I always am a little scared about, and I address you guys with the Q&A, because y'all have some really good questions. And it's not like, students who generally just say, is this going to be on the exam? So I will do my best to answer it. I will tell you if I do not know an answer, I will look it up, and what I'll do is I'll email Mark the answer and he can send it to you. Yeah, any questions?
What was the exact timing of the call for troops in the spring of 1862?
This happened in the spring, and I don't recall when it exactly happened, but the recruiting occurred in August.
Oh, not till then?
Yeah.
Because there was a smaller recruitment from northern governors in May,
Right.
specifically for the defense of Washington.
Right, and the thing is, also remember though, that was prior to Bull Run. This major recruiting thing was
Well, second Battle of Bull Run.
Right, and so the Union was having bunches of defeats, and it was more than just defending DC. This was to prosecute the war. And, people saw quite a few reversals, and you did not want to say, gosh darn it, how many hundreds of thousands have we already gave to the federal government? How many tens of thousands have been killed and wounded? And now you say you want more?
But I mean, that was a very quick recruitment. For example, Governor Sprague in Rhode Island had 2 new regiments in 36 hours, the 9th and the 10th
Well,
Rhode Island regiments.
What really happened, what was also going on too, is in the initial recruitment of troops, a lot more people wanted to become soldiers than they had room for. And so you had that demand signal, but then you also had some hesitancy over, well, how are we going to do this? The federal government has not authorized more, but it has to be a large number. It can't be tens of thousands. It needs to be hundreds of thousands.
But the larger recruitment was later, as you're
Right.
saying. Yeah.
And so how do we make that happen? And that was the genius of what Seward did, because Seward was a governor. He understood exactly how patronage worked then. And so he knew this is how you get the governors to do what he wanted them to do, by saying, you either do this, and you get to give out a lot of colonelcies and captaincies and tickets that you can cash in later, or you can say no, and then I'll just go to the mayors and citizen groups to do that. And no governor wanted to give up that responsibility, power, whatever you want to call it. So, that was a move that I do not think that Lincoln would have realized that, because although he did work with governors, I don't think he quite saw the political mechanics of the governorship as well as Seward did. And then, of course, you know, Seward being from New York, he definitely knew Curtin, he definitely knew the mayor of New York City, he definitely knew the Boston mayor, and so he was working with people that he was very familiar with. No, Jack, not you. What you got, Jack?
No comments on McClellan.
Mason Slidell, they were on the ship and were taken off the ship. Had we sent anyone there, meaning the northern states, over to England to push our cause?
Oh yeah, every country had an ambassador. The U.S. ambassador to England was Adams. I forget his first name.
Charles Francis.
Charles, right, he was of the famous Adams line. He was already in England. And those were the dispatches at the beginning of the war that Seward would be sending to him. Some of them are pretty, you know, tell the Brits if they don't, you know, if they try to do anything with the Confederates, we're going to go to war with them. And Lincoln would, you know, proofread them, edit them, and say, yeah, well, you try this. This sounds nicer, it's friendlier. So yeah, we had ambassadors over there, and very, very capable ambassadors too. Adams was, you know, followed in the footsteps of his ancestors. He was very patient. He was not rash. He was very well respected by the British government. He knew what he could say and couldn't say, and so he was very well respected over there in England. Whereas Mason and Slidell, especially Mason in England, he was seen as kind of a buffoon. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of British Parliament. Right? Very structured, where people, not written down, it's just you knew where to sit and where not to sit. Mason would sit in the front row, where the cabinet members sat. That's where he would sit. He would chew tobacco during meetings of Parliament, which was considered, how could he? And then, even though they gave him a spittoon, he often would miss. Okay. So the Brits didn't really think much of him, and they did not want to make the mistake of recognizing the Confederacy. So Adams, being the U.S. ambassador, had much greater access to the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Minister, and things like that. So the American diplomatic effort was much superior than that of the Confederacy. As a matter of fact, the first three ambassadors the Confederacy sent to Europe, they were sent to get them the heck out of the United States. Davis thought it'd be better to send them out there than field them in Richmond.
Yeah, but no, my question was analogous to that. It was, I just wanted to know what the interplay was between Seward and Charles Francis Adams, because Adams was a key figure in that time frame.
It's interesting to read the communications between Adams and Everett, and they are right in Boston, the Massachusetts Historical Society. Fascinating to read. And then Seward, you have to go between Boston and Rochester, New York, where Seward's papers are. Most of them, because they're official communications, are very formal. Very instructive. There's a lot of report back when. This is what the president would like. I did not run across any personal correspondence, because I was kind of limited in time. That would really be interesting to look at. But I think both of them saw each other as professionals. I don't know what their personal feelings were towards each other. But everything I saw was pretty straightforward, boring, diplomatic, government speak type stuff. But a lot of it was, you know, Seward would say, be very careful of what you do. Let me know what's going on. Do not keep secrets from me. And Adams would say, this is what I've heard going on. This is what I think. Until I get instructions from you, I am not going to do anything that might be incorrect. So, I mean, they were a pretty good team, I think.
The declaration of war on Spain and France, what was behind that?
Seward's thought was, you know what, Spain and France, they're in the hemisphere, you know, let's try to get into a conflict with them. I don't think they'll send big masses of troops over across the ocean. They got their own things they're worrying about. So if we do that, what's going to happen is the southern states, patriotism will, those that were true to the Union, which both Lincoln and Seward originally thought were lost. They thought there was a very strong Union sentiment in the southern states, that this would force the southern states back into the fold, and that they could get together and combat the common enemy, France and Spain. Lincoln said, no, we're not going to do that. And so it just kind of, that was a memo that Seward sent to Lincoln, and then Lincoln sent one back saying, no, I'm in charge. And this was basically just done between the two of them. This was not at a cabinet meeting, not in public. And this I think is important, because Lincoln could have said, what are you, stupid? Get the hell out of my cabinet. But he didn't. And when Lincoln shot Seward down, Seward didn't say, what the heck do you know? You're just from some kid from Indiana or Illinois or out that way. But he didn't. And so I think that interaction, although it could have been troublesome, I think both men realized that we got to be careful about what we do.
Any other questions? Lord Lyon sounds like a fascinating character in all of this, and how as a British ambassador he's kind of almost playing in favor sometimes of the Americans, so I'd be interested in perhaps a future talk maybe.
Well,
But he sounds like a fascinating person to learn more about.
he really was, and I think this is why he was Queen Victoria's favorite in the diplomatic corps. He never lost sight of what the goal was. He was not going to be the stereotypical Brit, not that there is one, but he was not going to go off on the handle. He wasn't going to try to push Seward around. He realized that Seward was in a tough spot. He realized that Lincoln was in a tough spot. But he also realized the British government was in a tough spot. They could not go to war against the United States. To ship any kind of an army across the Atlantic and supply it and fight it would just be logistically difficult. It would be financially difficult. Somebody, member of Parliament, actually said, whether or not it's true, I don't know, that it would be cheaper to put all the unemployed mill workers on the public dole than finance a war with the United States. So Lyons was smart enough to see all these different dimensions and figure out what do we need to do where both sides can be happy. And that's where he kind of worked with Seward, who had the same opinion, I think reached the same opinion, in coming up with the solution. Both sides can say, we got what we wanted. Both sides could say, we told you you were wrong. And so, win-win, everybody's happy. And I think that's why you don't hear much of these two guys, because they both work behind the scenes, and we're not glory seekers. Cool?